also a signal to the government, who are in control of fiscal policy. But next up, Rushanara.
Thank you and good afternoon. Just on that question about certainty, do you have a view, and apologies if you've already covered it, and apologies for not being able to be here from the beginning, do you have a view on the change of date for the statement that was due to come up on Halloween to November the 17th, and how that will affect the markets?
The question has not come
By
up.
Implication effect.
And the question has not come up, and it's a very valid one. So on one level, I just mentioned the importance of certainty. On one level, I think the market might be a little disappointed that the certainty which they were anticipating as soon as this coming Monday is not going to be there. But on another level, I think the market might also feel, given the fact that this is a full-blown autumn statement, that there will be much more certainty around everything in terms of fiscal measures that the government is planning for the immediate future. So actually, I don't think it's going to have too much effect, I hope I'm right about this, on the market, but we couldn't see, put it this way, in the immediate aftermath, I looked at screens before coming here, in the immediate aftermath of today's announcement, there was not much movement.
Okay, so Antoine Bouvet, who is the rates strategist at ING, said that delays were bad news for gilts. Delaying the budget statements until after the Bank of England meeting won't force the bank to take into account in its economic forecast the pushback and pushback more forcefully against hikes priced on the curve, he said. So I don't know what time he said this, whether it was before you checked and arrived, but there does seem to be some differences, and also the point about what the bank can do in line of sight is an important one. But we'll have to wait and see. But I just wondered if you wanted to comment on some of those observations.
Well, I think what he was highlighting was my point about two and a bit more weeks of uncertainty. And I think that's a valid point. But at the same time, as I say, that's one view. And don't forget, the market is made up of lots of different views all at the same time. The other view is, but we will get greater certainty around fiscal measures, wider fiscal policy. So I think these balance themselves out.
Provided there isn't any political instability in the next fortnight. And let's hope there isn't, for the sake of our economy. I've got one other overarching question before I go into the specifics around market instability on the 26th and 27th of September, and that is a kind of more wider point about the state of Britain's economic reputation, some of the kind of interventions that have been made by external players over the recent period, including the IMF and so on. Guy Hans, who runs a private equity firm, Tory donor, said that the UK faces higher taxes, lower benefits, and a possible International Monetary Fund bailout. And the last 6 years post-Brexit, partly due to the poor negotiation of a Brexit deal and so on, mistakes made in the last 6 years which have frankly put this country on a path to be the sick man of Europe. I mean, the context of that is, of course, about becoming indebted and a whole series of issues that we've are well rehearsed in recent weeks. What do you make of that observation? Should we now be less concerned because we've got a new Prime Minister and the markets seem temporarily anyway a little calmer than they have been, or is there a long term? Should we be concerned about these observations? I mean, not in a very long time have we heard phrases like that. But the recent episode in the Truss government and the events of 26th, 27th has led even Tory donors who are supportive of the government to make those observations. What's your view on that?
Well, because I'm a sort of markets hack, I suppose I just view these things from the perspective of the market. And I think we can all look at the events of the last few weeks, and if you look at them through this market prism, as I was sort of saying earlier as well, clearly some of the concerns that you mentioned, Guy Hans, that he expressed were being played out in the market. And that's not great.
It's a disaster, isn't it? I mean, it's an embarrassment for our country.
Well,
I mean, even emerging markets were having a field day looking at the state of what had been done to our economy, which was basically, it was a political irresponsibility. I mean, it's an understatement, isn't it, what you're saying? Isn't it a total disaster? And we're a laughingstock in the rest of the world now.
Well, I'm prone to understatement, which is probably a very good thing.
Admirable. Under the circumstances, Robert.
And I'll try and continue being as understated as possible. But let me put it, and I want to acknowledge...
Can I just say we don't want overstated people to be in charge of selling our goods.
Thank you. I'm reassured. Thank you. I do want to acknowledge an important point, which I do think you're sort of making indirectly, which is that, and this is a very markets view, but it's quite an important one, and that is that fixed income markets globally, and actually the UK gilt market is, notwithstanding all our sort of trials and tribulations, is and remains a very important global fixed income market. Is often it's a matter of relative value and relative valuations. So the market, we always talk about the market as if it's a single thing, but it's not. Yep. The market will always look at how we are faring compared to, for instance, I mentioned earlier, the United States or Germany or other jurisdictions. We do not, to use Dame Angela's expression, we do not want to be that little wildebeest who strays too far away from the herd. But if we can get back into the herd, and if we can be viewed as anything but an outlier, that is obviously important. And I think that the comment that you quoted from Guy Hans was precisely a concern around us being an outlier and being viewed as an outlier. And we've seen the consequence of that played out in the market. But we've also seen played out in the market, and I really do believe this, a much clearer acknowledgement and vote of confidence in terms of the subsequent direction that government has taken.
Well, it's debatable whether the government...
I'm only saying what the market, what you see in the market.
The government had to take that direction because of the reaction of the market and the actions of the Bank of England and the independent institutions who've had to reassert their authority ultimately. That's why it happened. But anyway, moving on. But thank you. Appreciate the response and the candidness, albeit with understated language. In the revision to the DMO's financing remit, published on the 23rd September, there was an offer to market participants to provide feedback on the provision operations calendar by 26th of September. What was the feedback like?
The feedback, because this is what we will always do after a fiscal event, was focused primarily or almost solely on what I would call operational matters for us, which means so a direct consequence of the remit revision on the 23rd was that we had to operationally schedule 13 more auctions between then and the end of the financial year. So the question that we then ask the market, and in particular our gilt-edge market makers, are around the sequencing of that, which operations should be scheduled on which day, what are their views, also even what particular issues would they like us to see, shorts, mediums, longs. It's all around, if you like, the operational delivery. It's not a view on is this a good thing or a bad thing. The market, like we do, just takes for granted ultimately what our political masters will decide, and they will see that borrowing number, and the market will then give us feedback directly on the best way to deliver that financing.
And how does that compare? And feel free to others to come in if you need to or want to. How does that compare with other times? This period compared to other. Jessica,
do you want? I mean,
in terms of volume and number of operations and so on. So it's. One of the issues for us compared, say, with the COVID period in 2021 is when the statement actually happened. Because in COVID times, we were just given a much longer, we had a huge, as you know, financing remit, well in excess of what we're going to be issuing this year in terms of just the DMO's issuance. But it was announced in April, and then it was extended into July, and then extended again. So we had a significant amount of time in which to deliver that.
You knew it was coming, as opposed to...
Well, we didn't know exactly what was coming.
Well, except that once the pandemic hit, you knew the government would have to take a series of unusual actions, right?
Exactly. And as has already been discussed, there was also a big buyer in the market, which was helpful. The difference here is that we do have a very compressed amount of time in order to deliver the amount that was mentioned on the 23rd of September.
Would you say that was unprecedented?
In terms of net supply, i.e. without a big buyer in the market, it was unprecedented.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Just to give a bit of context then, the numbers of operations, we over the course of the rest of the year, the 13 plus 1 is an extra. So that's within 6 months we've got to deliver. Well, over the whole of the 12 months, we're delivering around 71 operations. That compares with 71 last year, but the pandemic year was around 159. I think there's only 1 year prior to then, in the 25 years of our history, almost next year, that we did anything near that, and that was close to the financial crisis. Mm-hmm. So where we did 77 operations in a year. But so just to recap, really, in 22-23 we'll be doing 71 operations, same as last year, but in the pandemic year, which was an exception, we're up at 159, where we were raising basically 40 billion a month. So it's quite a large,
unprecedented
number.
Thank you. Andrew Hawser of the Bank of England recently provided the committee with a graphic description of his increasingly worrying conversations with LDI funds before the bank's gilt market intervention on the 28th September. Can you describe to us what market participants were communicating to you across this period? And by all means, feel free to use understated or colourful language, whichever takes your fancy. He used quite colourful language.
I've already warned you, I try to avoid colourful language. But, I mean, clearly the market was extremely stressed. Yep. And we were hearing directly from market participants just how stressed matters were. The bank was obviously hearing it too. I even recall that Andrew Hawser sort of sent me a message and sort of asked for my views on what we wanted to know, what were we hearing from the market in terms of linkers in particular, and there was a real concern. I heard directly from one or two basically pension funds that operated LDI schemes saying what stress they were under, and I know that they also made the same representations to the Bank of England. There was a lot of stress at that time, I think it's fair to say. Then there was, sometimes sort of terms are sort of thrown around, sort of doom loop, which I don't particularly like, because I think it also actually doesn't describe exactly what was going on. I mean, in my opinion, what you saw happen was actually a classic situation which occurs in finance, where arguably existing risk management strategies were exposed as not having been adequate.
Could you say a bit more about the risk management strategy? Who should have done that risk management strategy better? Are you saying that there's something that banks should have done?
No, I'm talking specifically about the pension,
the pension funds.
The pension funds.
So is that something that the regulator should have done more about, or is it that they didn't factor in a set of decisions, i.e. unfunded government tax cuts of the order that we saw without independent forecasts and so on, that they should have factored that in as part of the risk management strategy? I mean, it's a question I asked an equivalent question I asked the Bank of England about, whether stress testing now needs to extend to a set of decisions, fiscal policy decisions that government makes, and if it doesn't make them in the normal way, with warnings and with independent assessments, then it's clearly a risk to financial stability, as stated by the Bank of England. Are we now saying actually the risk management in relation to the pension regulator needs to factor in those sorts of scenarios? Because that's essentially what would have needed to be done, wouldn't it, in this scenario?
We're not a regulator. I think it's very important to say that. But I think what is clear, and has been clear to the entire market, is that the extent of the margin calls that some of these funds faced was never anticipated, because they equally did not anticipate the sort of price movements that you saw occur in the gilt market and the movements in yields to that extent. And this is what happens in any leverage position. And you will have heard, as we did, that supposedly the big issue was around liquidity rather than solvency. But I think there is a clear lesson for everybody there, which is you always need to be in a position to meet your obligations.
Thank you.
Jessica, do you want to?
Yes, maybe just to add one tiny point to that, is that market conditions were already fragile even before the 23rd of September, and they had been really throughout a lot of the summer. Including particularly in the gilt market as well. And I think, therefore, it was against that backdrop that it was partly the magnitude of the moves. And remember, there was also a bank rate decision on the 22nd as well. And it was also the velocity of the moves which were problematic, probably from a stress testing point of view.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rushanara. Over to you now, Alison.